The phone call came at 4:37 in the morning. Sergeant Major Colin Hayes was already awake. He had been staring at the ceiling for hours, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. When the phone rang, his wife stirred beside him, but he was already reaching for it. "Hayes," he said, his voice rough.
"Alan?"
"It's Wallace. You need to turn on the television now." The line went dead. Colin's hands were shaking as he reached for the remote. The screen flickered to life, and the words at the bottom made his heart stop. "Princess Diana dead in Paris car crash." His wife gasped behind him. But Colin couldn't move. He just stared at the screen, at the wreckage, at the chaos, at the faces of reporters who looked like they couldn't believe what they were saying. Diana. Gone. The woman he had sworn to protect. The woman he had stood beside on the most important day of her life. The woman who had smiled at him once, 20 years ago, and changed everything. Colin didn't cry, not yet. But his chest felt hollow, like someone had reached in and taken something vital. He sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the remote, still staring. "Colin?" His wife whispered. He didn't answer. He was remembering, if you're moved by stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and the people history forgets, stay with us. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Colin. Hayes was 24 years old when he first saw Princess Diana. It was July 1981. London was burning with summer heat, and the entire city was preparing for a wedding the world would never forget. Colin was a junior member of the Household Cavalry, assigned to ceremonial duties at St. Paul's Cathedral. He had been trained for this. Months of drills, inspections, and rehearsals. Stand still. Eyes forward. Do not move unless ordered. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment. She stepped out of the glass coach. The crowd roared. Cameras flashed like lightning. And there she was, Lady Diana Spencer. 19 years old. Wrapped in ivory silk and lace, her train stretching 25 feet behind her. She looked terrified. Colin was standing at the base of the cathedral steps, part of the honor guard lining her path. He wasn't supposed to look at her, but he did, and for just a second, as she passed. Her eyes met his. She was trembling. Colin felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just duty anymore. This was a young woman, alone in front of the entire world, walking toward a life she couldn't escape. He wanted to tell her it would be okay. He wanted to tell her she wasn't alone, but he was just a soldier. So he stood still. The ceremony lasted hours. The heat inside the cathedral was unbearable. Colin's uniform was soaked with sweat. His legs ached, but he didn't move. Afterward, when the royal family emerged, Diana looked different. She was smiling now, waving to the crowd. But Colin saw it. The tightness around her eyes. The way her hand gripped the prince's arm just a little too hard. She was putting on a performance. And somehow, Colin understood, because that's what they both did. They stood where they were told. They smiled when they were supposed to. They played their roles, but deep down, they were both just people trying to survive. Colin never spoke to her that day. He wasn't supposed to. But as the golden carriage pulled away and the crowds began to scatter, he made a silent promise. If she ever needed someone to stand beside her again, he would be there. He didn't know it then. But that promise would follow him for the rest of his life. And 16 years later, when the world fell apart, it would be the only thing that mattered. Colin didn't see Diana again for 3 years. By then, everything had changed. He had been promoted, transferred, assigned to different duties. But he followed her story like everyone else. The fairy tale was cracking. The tabloids were vicious. They printed everything. Her struggles with bulimia. The rumors about Charles. The coldness of the royal family. Diana was no longer the blushing bride. She was a woman trapped, and the whole world was watching her suffer. Colin hated it. In 1984, he was reassigned to Royal Protection Detail. It was supposed to be temporary, a 6-month rotation, but fate had other plans. One rainy afternoon in November, Colin was stationed outside Kensington Palace. He was part of a small security team monitoring the perimeter. It was quiet. Boring even. Then the side gate opened. Diana walked out alone. No security. No attendants. Just her, in a long coat and a scarf, walking like she needed to breathe. Colin's partner radioed it in immediately. "Ma'am, you're not scheduled for, I know," she said, cutting him off. Her voice was soft but firm. "I just need a walk. 10 minutes, please." She looked directly at Colin. And again, just like that day at the cathedral, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding. Colin nodded. "We'll follow at a distance, ma'am," she smiled. A real smile this time. "Thank you." They walked behind her, keeping watch but giving her space. She wandered through the park, hands in her pockets, face tilted toward the rain. She didn't look like a princess. She looked like someone trying to remember what freedom felt like. When she returned to the gate, she paused. "What's your name?" she asked Colin. "Sergeant Major Hayes." "Ma'am." "Colin Hayes." She repeated it like she was committing it to memory. "You were at my wedding, weren't you?" He was stunned. "Yes, ma'am. St. Paul's. I was part of the honor guard." "I remember," she said quietly. "You looked at me. Most of them didn't, but you did." Colin didn't know what to say. "Thank you for letting me walk today," she said. Then she turned and disappeared through the gate. After that, Colin was permanently assigned to her detail. He became part of the invisible wall around her. The man in the background. The one who watched, who waited, made sure she was safe even when the world felt dangerous. And over the years, something unexpected happened. She began to trust him, not in grand gestures, but in small moments. A glance when the press became too aggressive. A quiet thank you when he intercepted a photographer. Once, during a particularly brutal media frenzy, she had stopped in a hallway, visibly shaking. And Colin had simply stepped closer.
"You're safe, ma'am,"
he said. "I've got you." She had looked at him with tears in her eyes and nodded. Colin never overstepped. He never spoke unless spoken to. But Diana knew. She knew he wasn't just doing a job. He cared. By 1992, the marriage was over. The separation was announced. Diana was alone in ways that went beyond titles and palaces, and Colin was still there. He stood outside hospital rooms when she visited sick children. He waited in parking garages during secret charity meetings. He walked behind her at galas where the press screamed her name like vultures. He watched her transform. From the fragile girl at the cathedral to a woman who used her pain to help others. She held the hands of AIDS patients when no one else would. She walked through minefields to raise awareness. She spoke about mental health and loneliness, and the parts of life that royalty wasn't supposed to. Acknowledged. Colin was proud of her, but he also saw the cost. Late nights when she returned to the palace, with her makeup smudged from crying. Mornings when she barely ate. The way she flinched when cameras flashed too close. Diana was drowning, and no one was saving her except maybe him. In the only way he knew how? By standing beside her? By being the one constant in a life full of chaos. In 1996, the divorce was finalized. Diana was no longer Her Royal Highness. She lost her title. Her security was reduced. The palace was cutting her loose. Colin requested to stay on her detail. It was denied. "She's no longer a senior royal," his commander said. "We have protocols." "She's still in danger," Colin argued. "The press, the threats, it's not our concern anymore." Colin felt something break inside him. That night, he did something he had never done before. He called Diana's private secretary and asked for a meeting. 2 days later, he stood in her sitting room at Kensington Palace. She looked smaller somehow, tired. "They're pulling you off my detail," she said before he could speak. "Yes, ma'am." "Whoa," she smiled sadly. "I knew this was coming. They're taking everything." "I'm sorry, ma'am." She walked to the window, staring out at the gardens. "You've been with me for 12 years, Colin. Do you know that?" He nodded. "You're the only one who never asked for anything, who never sold a story, who never looked at me like I was broken." "You're not broken, ma'am." She turned to face him, and her eyes were wet. "Will you stay?" "Privately, I mean. I can pay you myself. I know it's not the same, but yes, Colin said immediately. You didn't let me finish. I don't need to, ma'am. The answer is yes. Diana exhaled, and for the first time in months, she looked relieved. Thank you, she whispered. Colin stayed. Not as an official guard, but as the man who would stand beside her, no matter what, even when the world told him to walk away. The summer of 1997 was different. Diana seemed lighter, freer. She was dating again, traveling, laughing in ways Colin hadn't seen in years. The divorce was behind her. The boys were growing up. She was building a life on her own terms. Colin was happy for her, but he was also worried the paparazzi had become more aggressive. They followed her everywhere, chased her car, climbed walls to get photos. It was relentless. They're going to hurt her, Colin told his wife one night. You can't protect her from everything, she said gently. I know, but I have to try. In late August, Diana told Colin she was going to Paris for the weekend. A short trip. Nothing official. We'll have French security, she said. You don't need to come. Colin didn't like it. But he also knew she needed space. She needed to feel normal. Be careful, ma'am, he said. She smiled. Always. That was the last time he spoke to her. The call came at 4:37 in the morning on August 31st, and now, sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the television, Colin felt the world collapse. Diana was gone. The details came slowly. A car crash in a tunnel, paparazzi chasing her. The driver speeding, the impact. She had been alive when they pulled her from the wreckage. But she didn't make it. Colin sat in his living room for hours, watching the same footage over and over. The tunnel, the wreckage, the flowers already piling up outside Kensington Palace. His phone rang again. It was Wallace. Colin, they're asking for you. Who? The family. They want you on the honor guard. For the funeral? Colin closed his eyes. Of course they did. Even in death, Diana needed him to stand beside her. When? He asked. September 6th. Westminster Abbey. The whole world will be watching. The whole world. Colin thought about the wedding. How young she had been. How scared. How he had promised, silently, to always be there if she needed him. Now, she needed him one last time. I'll be there, he said. The days leading up to the funeral were a blur. London was drowning in grief. Flowers covered every street near the palace. People sobbed openly. Strangers hugged each other. The outpouring was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Colin couldn't leave his house without seeing her face. On newspapers, on television, on posters held by mourners, Diana smiling. Diana with her sons. Diana holding a child in a hospital. Everyone had a memory of her. Everyone had a story. But Colin's story was different, because he had been there. He had seen the woman behind the photographs, the one who cried in hallways, the one who fought to stay strong even when everything was falling apart, and now she was gone. The night before the funeral, Colin stood in his dress uniform staring at himself in the mirror. His hands were shaking. His wife came up behind him. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. Colin, you haven't slept in days. You barely eat. You're grieving. So is the whole world, he said. But I'm the one who has to stand. She wrapped her arms around him. She was lucky to have you. Colin didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow. September 6th, 1997. The morning was gray and cold. Westminster Abbey was surrounded by crowds. Millions of people lined the streets. Cameras from every country in the world were pointed at the same place. Colin arrived early. He was part of the ceremonial guard lining the entrance to the Abbey. 8 men, perfectly still, as the coffin passed. He had done this 100 times. Funerals, ceremonies, state events. He knew how to stand, how to breathe, how to stay composed, but this was different. When the hearse arrived, draped in the royal standard and covered in white lilies, Colin felt his chest tighten. Inside that coffin was the girl from the cathedral, the woman who had smiled at him in the rain, the one who had trusted him when no one else would. The pallbearers lifted the coffin onto their shoulders. The crowd was silent. Not a single sound except the slow, measured footsteps of the soldiers. Colin stood at attention as they approached, and then he saw them. William and Harry, 12 and 15 years old, walking behind their mother's coffin, their faces pale, their eyes red. Trying so hard to be brave, Colin's throat burned. He wanted to look away, but he towed. Diana had loved those boys more than anything in the world. And now they were walking behind her in front of 2.5 billion people, saying goodbye. The coffin passed. Colin didn't move, didn't blink, but inside he was breaking. The service was long. Elton John sang. Diana's brother gave a speech that made the royal family shift uncomfortably in their seats. The world watched, cried, and said goodbye. Colin stood outside the entire time, motionless, silent. When it was over, the coffin was carried out again. The same slow procession, the same unbearable silence. And Colin stood one last time as Diana passed him by. He didn't cry, not there, not in front of the cameras, but later. When the crowds had gone and the streets were empty, Colin sat alone in his car and wept. He had kept his promise. He had stood beside her, from her wedding to her funeral, from the beginning to the end. But it didn't feel like enough. It would never feel like enough. Colin didn't sleep for weeks after the funeral. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the coffin, the boys, the flowers, the silence of millions of people standing in the streets, all mourning the same woman. He tried to go back to normal, back to work, back to life. But nothing felt normal anymore. His commanding officer gave him leave. "Take time, Colin. You've earned it." But time didn't help, because time just gave him space to think, to remember, to replay every moment he could have done something different. What if he had insisted on going to Paris? What if he had been in the car? What if he had stopped her from getting in at all? The guilt ate at him. His wife found him one night, sitting in the dark, staring at a photograph. It was from 1991, Diana, at a charity event, smiling as she spoke to a group of children. Colin was in the background, barely visible, watching over her. "You couldn't have saved her," his wife said softly. "I was supposed to protect her." "You did. For 16 years, you did." Colin shook his head. "It wasn't enough." "Colin, you gave her something no one else could. You gave her someone who saw her. Not the princess, not the icon, just her." He looked up at his wife, tears streaming down his face, and now she's gone. She held him as he cried. And for the first time since that phone call, Colin let himself break. Months passed. The world moved on. Memorials were built. Documentaries were made. Diana became a legend. But for Colin, she was still the young woman who had looked at him in the rain and said thank you. In early 1998, it was from Diana's private secretary. Inside was a handwritten note. Sergeant Major Hayes, Princess Diana, left instructions regarding her personal effects and wishes. She wanted you to have this. Attached was a small photograph, the same one Colin had been holding that night. Diana at the charity event. Colin in the background. On the back, in her handwriting, were 3 words. "Always watching over me." Colin sat down hard. His hands were shaking. She had known. She had seen him. Not just as a guard, but as the person who had stood beside her when the world became too heavy. He framed the photograph and hung it in his study. And every day he looked at it and remembered, not the funeral, not the tragedy, but the moments in between. The walks in the rain. The quiet thank yous. The times when she had smiled at him and he had known without words that she understood. That they had both been playing roles. But with each other, they had been real. Colin retired from service in 2000. He couldn't do it anymore. Stand at ceremonies, guard palaces. Pretend that duty was enough. Because the truth was, Diana had changed him. She had shown him that beneath the uniforms and the protocols, there were just people. Fragile, complicated, beautiful people trying to survive. He moved to the countryside with his wife. A quiet life, away from London. away from the memories that still hurt too much. But he never stopped thinking about her. Every year. On August 31st, Colin visited the memorial at Kensington Palace. He brought white lilies, Diana's favorite. He didn't stay long, just a few minutes. Long enough to stand there, like he always had, and remember. One year a young woman approached him. She looked to be in her 20s. She had been crying. "Were you there?" she asked. At the funeral, Colin nodded. "I was only 8 years old," she said, "but I remember watching it on television. I remember thinking she must have been so loved. Because the whole world stopped." "She was," Colin said quietly. The woman placed her flowers down and wiped her eyes. "I wish I could have met her. She would have liked that," Colin said. "We loved people, really loved them. It wasn't an act." The woman smiled and walked away. Colin stood there a moment longer. For the first time in years, he felt something other than grief. He felt gratitude, because he had known her. It's the real her. And that was something no one could take away. In 2007, an inquiry was held into Diana's death. Colin was called to testify about her security in the years before the crash. He sat in the courtroom, surrounded by lawyers and reporters, and answered their questions. But the whole time, he was thinking about something else. About the last time he had seen her. The way she had smiled and said, "Be careful, ma'am." The way she had replied, "Always." She'd been so full of life, so full of hope. And then, in an instant, she was gone. When the lawyers asked him if he thought her death could have been prevented, Colin paused. "I think," he said slowly, "that Diana spent her whole life being chased by cameras, by expectations, by people who wanted something from her. And in the end, that's what killed her, not the crash, the chase." The room was silent. "She deserved better," Colin said. "She deserved to be free." The inquiry concluded months later. Accidental death, no conspiracy, just a tragic collision of speed, circumstance, and a world that couldn't let her go. Colin wasn't surprised, but he was still angry. Because Diana had been more than a headline. More than a tragedy, she'd been a person, and the world had forgotten that. As the years went on, Colin watched as William and Harry grew up, got married, had children of their own. He saw the way they honored their mother, the way they spoke about her with love and pride, the way they carried her legacy forward, and he was proud too, because Diana had been right. She had been strong. She had survived so much. And even though she was gone, her sons were proof that love endures. One day Colin received an invitation. It was for the unveiling of a statue in Diana's honor at Kensington Palace, July 1st, 2021. What would have been her 60th birthday? William and Harry would both be there. Colin almost didn't go. He was older now. His health wasn't what it used to be. And the memories were still heavy, but his wife convinced him. "She'd want you there," she said. So Colin went. The ceremony was small, intimate, nothing like the funeral. Just family, close friends, and a few others who had been part of Diana's life. When the statue was revealed, Colin felt his throat tightened. It was her, surrounded by 3 children, arms open, smiling. The way she had always been, giving, loving, present. William spoke. Harry spoke. They thanked everyone who had kept their mother's memory alive. And then, after the ceremony, William approached Colin. "Sergeant Major Hayes," he said, extending his hand. Colin shook it, surprised the prince even knew his name. "My mother wrote about you," William said quietly, "in her diaries. She said you were the one person who never made her feel alone." Colin couldn't speak. "Thank you," William said. "For everything you did for her." Colin nodded, his eyes burning with tears. "It was an honor, sir, and it was every moment of it." Colin left the ceremony in a daze. William's words echoed in his mind. "You were the one person who never made her feel alone." He had never known. Diana had never said. But somehow, she had written it down. Kept a record. Made sure someone would know. That night, Colin sat with his wife and told her everything. About the diaries. About William. About the weight he had been carrying for 24 years. She knew, his wife said, tears in her eyes. She knew what you did for her. "I just wish I could have done more," Colin said. "You did enough. You gave her peace, when the world gave her chaos. That's not nothing, Colin. That's everything. For the first time since 1997, Colin felt like he could breathe. But the past wasn't done with him yet. In 2022, a journalist contacted Colin. She was writing a book about the people who had been closest to Diana, the ones history had forgotten. "I want to tell your story," she said. The guard who stood beside her from beginning to end. Colin hesitated. He had spent decades staying silent, never speaking to the press, never selling his story like so many others had. "Why now?" he asked. "Because people need to remember her," the journalist said. "Not as a victim, not as a saint, but as a person, and you knew that person better than most." Colin thought about it for days. Finally, he agreed, but only on one condition. "I don't want money," he said. "Any proceeds go to one of her charities." "That's the deal," the journalist agreed. Over the next several months, Colin sat for interviews. He told her about the wedding, the walks in the rain, the late nights at the palace, the funeral. He told her about the woman the world never saw, the one who was funny and kind and scared and brave all at once. "She used to apologize," Colin said, "for taking up space, for needing help." Can you imagine? A princess apologizing for existing. The journalist wrote it all down. "What do you want people to know about her?" she asked at the end. Colin thought for a long time. "She was real," he said. "That she loved deeply, that she hurt deeply, and that she spent her whole life trying to make the world better, even when the world was cruel to her." The book was published in the spring of 2023. It became a bestseller. People wrote to Colin, thousands of them, strangers from all over the world, thanking him for protecting Diana, for honoring her, for not letting her be forgotten. One letter stood out. It was from a woman in her 40s. She had been homeless for years, struggling with addiction, but she had found help at one of Diana's charities, the same charity that was now receiving proceeds from the book. "Your story reminded me that people care," the woman wrote, "that someone, somewhere, is always watching over us. Thank you for being that person for her. And thank you for being that person for people like me." Colin cried when he read it, because that's what Diana had done. She had seen people, the ones the world ignored, and she had made them feel like they mattered, and now, in some small way, Colin was helping continue that work. It felt right. In the summer of 2024, Colin's health began to decline. He was 73 years old. His heart was failing. The doctors said he had months, maybe a year. Colin wasn't afraid. He had lived a good life. He had loved and been loved. He had served his country. He had kept his promise. But there was one thing he wanted to do before the end. He asked his wife to take him to Kensington Palace. One last time. It was a quiet morning in August. The sky was pale blue. The gardens were full of flowers. Tourists walked past, taking photos. Unaware of the man sitting on the bench by the memorial, Colin sat there for a long time, staring at the statue, at Diana's face, at her open arms. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. "I stood beside you, from your wedding to your funeral, and even after. I stood." He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. "I hope you know that," he whispered. "I hope you know you weren't alone." A breeze moved through the trees, and for just a moment, Colin felt a peace he hadn't felt in years, like someone was telling him, "I know. Thank you." Duh. It was addressed to William and Harry. In it, Colin wrote about their mother, about the woman she had been, about the love she had for them, about the strength she had carried even when the world tried to break her. "Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew," Colin wrote. "Not because she was fearless, but because she was terrified and she kept going anyway. She did it for you. She did it for the people who needed her. And she did it because she believed the world could be better. I was honored to stand beside her, and I'm honored to have known her. She would be so proud of you both." The letter was delivered. And William, upon reading it, made sure Colin was honored. At Colin's funeral, a small, private ceremony, there was a wreath of white lilies. The card read, "From William and Harry. In gratitude for the man who stood beside our mother." Colin's wife wept when she saw it, because her husband had spent his whole life standing in the background, never asking for recognition, never seeking praise, but in the end, the people who mattered most had seen him, and they had remembered. Years later, when historians looked back at Diana's life, they spoke of her charity work, her grace, her struggles, her tragic death. But those who looked closer found something else. They found the names of people like Colin Hayes, the ones who had stood beside her, who had protected her, who had loved her not because she was a princess, but because she was a person, and those people, the quiet ones, the invisible ones, were the reason Diana had survived as long as she did. Because they had given her something the world couldn't. They had given her someone to lean on. Colin's story became part of her legacy, a reminder that behind every public figure, there are private heroes. People who sacrifice, who serve, who stand guard even when no one is watching. And maybe act. In the end, that's what loyalty really is. Not the grand gestures, not the headlines, but the quiet promise to be there, to stand, to protect, no matter what. The memorial at Westminster Abbey is quiet most days. Tourists pass through, reading plaques, snapping photos. They pause at the tombs of kings and queens, poets and warriors. But there's a smaller plaque, tucked near the east wall, that few people notice. It reads, "In memory of those who served in silence." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "For the protectors, the guardians, and the loyal. May your service never be forgotten." It was placed there in 2025, funded anonymously. But those who knew the story understood. It was for people like Colin Hayes, the ones history overlooks. The ones who stand in the background of famous photographs, barely visible, doing the work that makes everything else possible. Colin never wanted a statue. He never wanted his name in headlines. But his story mattered, because it reminded the world that behind every icon, every legend, there are real people holding them up. And sometimes, those people are the only thing keeping the whole world from falling apart. Diana's sons grew older. They had families of their own now. George, Charlotte, Louis, Archie, Lilibet. A new generation, far removed from the tragedy of 1997. But William and Harry made sure their children knew about their grandmother, not the princess from the fairy tale, but the real woman, the one who held hands with the sick, the one who laughed too loud and cried too hard, the one who loved them fiercely and taught them to see people, not titles. And sometimes, when they told those stories, they mentioned Colin, there was a man, William would say, who stood beside your grandmother when no one else would, who protected her, who saw her. What happened to him? George asked once. He lived a good life, William said, and when he died, he was at peace, because he knew he had kept his promise. George thought about that for a moment. Do you think Grandma knew? William smiled. I think she did, across the world, in small towns, in big cities. People still remembered Diana. They lit candles on the anniversary of her death. They visited memorials. They donated to her charities. They told their children about the princess who had broken the rules and loved, without limits. But some people remembered Colin too. The veterans who had served alongside him. The royal staff who had seen him stand guard year after year. The journalists who had heard whispers of the loyal sergeant who never left. Diana sighed. They didn't make movies about him. They didn't write songs. But they remembered, and maybe that was enough. Because the best kind of heroism isn't loud. It isn't flashy. It's quiet, steady, relentless. It's showing up every day, even when no one is watching. Even when there's no applause. Even when it hurts. Colin had done that. For 16 years, he had stood. And when Diana died, he had stood again. Not for glory. Not for recognition, but because he had promised. And promises to people like Colin were everything. In 2027, a documentary was released. The people around Diana featured interviews with her staff, her friends, her security team, people who had known her beyond the headlines. Colin's story was given its own segment. His wife, now elderly, but still sharp, sat in front of the camera and spoke about the man she had loved for 50 years. He never talked about it, she said. Not really. But I knew. I knew what Diana meant to him. Not as a princess, but as a person who needed someone steady, someone who wouldn't leave. The interviewer asked if Colin had ever regretted it. The years of service, the weight of responsibility, the grief. His wife smiled. Not once. He used to say that standing beside her was the greatest honor of his life. And he meant it. Do you think she knew how much he cared? Yes, his wife said without hesitation. She knew. And I think in her own way, she cared for him too. The documentary aired on the 30th anniversary of Diana's death. Millions of people watched, and for a brief moment, the world remembered Colin Hayes, not as a footnote, but as a man who had mattered, who had made a difference, who had stood. The flowers came back to Kensington Palace that year. Not as many as before, but enough. White lilies, mostly. Diana's favorite, and tucked among them, someone left a small handwritten note for Colin Hayes, the guard who never left. No one knew who wrote it, but it didn't matter, because the sentiment was shared by thousands. People who understood that loyalty isn't about titles or rank, it's about showing up, being present, choosing to stand even when it's hard. Colin had done that. And in doing so, he had become part of something bigger than himself. He had become part of Diana's story, and she had become part of his dot to people from different worlds, bound together by a silent promise that no matter what happened, no matter how dark it got, someone would always be standing guard. On a quiet morning in August, 30 years after Diana's death, a young girl visited the memorial at Kensington Palace. She was 8 years old, the same age as the woman who had once approached Colin all those years ago. She stared at the statue of Diana, surrounded by children, and asked her mother a question.
Was she really that kind?
Her mother nodded. She was, and there were people who made sure she stayed safe. People who believed in her. Like who? Like a soldier named Colin Hayes. He stood beside her for almost her whole life. And even after she was gone, he made sure people remembered her. The girl thought about that. That's a good friend, her mother smiled. Yes, it is. The girl placed a flower down, a single white lily, and somewhere in a place beyond grief and time. Maybe Diana and Colin both smiled because the promise had been kept, not just by him, but by everyone who chose to remember, to honor. To stand, Colin Hayes wasn't famous. He wasn't a prince or a celebrity. He didn't change laws or win wars, but he did something more important. He saw someone who was hurting, and he stayed. He gave her stability in a world of chaos, peace in a storm, strength when she had none left, and when the world took her away, he made sure her memory lived on, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to love, resilience, and the power of simply being there. That's the story of the guard who stood for Diana, from her wedding, where she trembled on the cathedral steps, to her funeral, where 2.5 billion people said goodbye, from the quiet walks in the rain to the moments when she looked at him and said thank you, from the first time their eyes met to the last time he stood beside her casket. Colin Hayes was there, and because of him, Diana was never truly alone. That's not just a story about royalty or duty. It's a story about what it means to be human, to see someone, to stand beside them, to keep your promise no matter what. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of story the world needs more of. Not the ones about crowns and palaces, but the ones about the people who hold the weight, the ones who stand guard, the ones who never leave.